Hey, Slater Crusaders, America's the greatest country in the world. Welcome to this week's special, The Woke of Wall Street. Why has nearly every major company gone so stinking woke? The moment when I first woke up to this was Oreo. Oreo, back in February, sent this random tweet for no reason whatsoever. Trans people exist. It's like, what? And then this special pack of pronouns. Ask me my pronoun. Partnering with the National Center for Transgender Equality. You're like, what in the Oreo? What is happening? Now, the NFL, of course, was the most obvious example. Their embrace of Black Lives Matter and Colin Kaepernick and the whole thing. And they just so obviously lost sight of their audience. And note, the NFL, it's just a TV show. It's a TV show with an audience who goes to stadiums and buys food and jerseys. And if it's clear that you hate me, NFL and woke company, if it's clear that you hate me and my worldview, and you are actively pushing out a worldview that is antithetical to mine, then I'm not going to give you my money anymore. But what's tricky is it's odd is that so many of these companies, they're not even going after your money anymore. Right? They're inspired by a different motivation. So coming up, we're going to talk about the difference between shareholder capitalism, as espoused by people like the great Milton Friedman, and stakeholder capitalism. Two very different visions. And we're living in the latter. We're living in a stakeholder capitalist system. There's no doubt about it. At least we are in America. In China, American companies are playing the commies game. They're doing their bidding and kissing their boots. This is why ESPN, this is my go-to example for this one. ESPN, which is owned by Disney, they were talking about the NBA. Do you remember this is a couple years ago, the NBA players and coaches were not allowed to talk about Hong Kong? The Houston Rockets general manager sent out a tweet, "Fight for freedom, stand with Hong Kong." And the communists in China freaked out. And they threatened the NBA that, hey, listen, stop with your whole freedom of speech thing. Otherwise, we're going to stop broadcasting your product to 1.4 billion people. That's 3 times the number of Americans are in China. 4 times. 1.4 billion. So because of that, the NBA players, they're all social activists at home, vocal activists at home, but refuse to say a word about actual genocide going on in China. So in the midst of all that, ESPN did a story on all that, and they put this map of China up. That map of China is only recognized by China. It shows the ownership, the 9 dashes, called the 9-dash map. That shows their ownership of the South China Sea. How did ESPN even get that map? Right? How did Disney even get it? Right? If you Google map of China, that doesn't pop up. You have to actively go get it. So how did that go down? How did that map happen? I want to get to the bottom of that map. How did that work? I'm seriously wonder if there's like a communist, like a Chinese consultant at ESPN who saw that they were going to use the real map of China and was like, no, you have to use this communist-approved map. That is bizarre. We get it. We see it everywhere, right? We need to fight back. Businesses are now fully engaged in the culture war, so we have to fight on that front too. We played this clip the other day of Ron DeSantis, governor of Florida, saying he's ready to fight the culture war. We've had a lot of Republicans for a couple decades now saying, nope, we're only going to fight for lower taxes and less regulation. And they didn't even do that effectively. But that's all we're going to do. We're the taxes and regulation party. And we just let the culture war go over here, and the progressives came in and they've just run roughshod over it all. And now we got drag queens teaching kids on Nick Jr. about transgender rights. And right, that's what happens when you let that fight go unfought, right? So Ron DeSantis comes out, he's like, no, I'm fighting the culture war. And the culture war has to be fought in our schools, but now, oddly, it's got to be fought even in the business world and in our economy. Here's what Ron DeSantis said.
Some of these battles with what the left is doing and wokeism, it's effectively cultural Marxism. And so you can have theoretically a successful economy, but if the underpinnings of the culture are just being torn apart, I don't think that that's a society that's going to be very, very successful over the long term.
Mm-hmm.
Love that line. And now, it's interesting. It used to be, we'll have the economy over here, and then we have the culture war over here. And now they're the same. Got to push back. Push back with your money, obviously. But we need to push back with our rhetoric as well, strongly, boldly, especially people in the business world as well. This is, there's some oil and gas company, and they wanted to buy North Face jackets for their employees, right? They're going to buy North Face jackets and put their little company logo on it like thousands of companies do. And North Face, they came back and they said, no, we're not going to let you buy our jackets. And this oil company was told that you do not meet the North Face brand standards. Brand standard? What do you mean we don't meet North Face's brand standards? What do you do? And it turns out it's because they're an oil and gas company. And North Face did not want to be associated with supporting an oil and gas company. So what do you do? All right, let's say you're that company. What do? You say, oh, okay, North Face, sorry. Or do you fight back? Well, the oil and gas industry is fighting back because all of the products at North Face are made from oil. Every single product at the North Face is made from oil. Where do you think all those space-age materials come from? Asteroids, Mars, what do you think? They come from oil. The jackets, pants, hats, gloves, it's all oil. Unless they're made out of wool. I don't know. A lot of wool, fat, I don't know, it's all oil. 60% of all clothing fabrics are made from oil. And at the North Face, it's over 90%. And forget even the product itself, even after the product is made, right? The manufacturing of it, the distribution of it, the retail of it, all of it made possible from oil. Even if all the North Face did was make wool sweaters from sheep, how are you going to get them to people? A solar-powered truck? How are solar panels made? Right? Everything comes back to oil and gas. And then the North Face comes out and says, we don't want to be associated with oil. You are oil. You're an oil company. Right? You're just selling a different form of oil. And you're going to come out and say that you're against oil? You are oil. It is the height of hypocrisy for the North Face, a business that would not be in business, could not exist if we're not for oil and gas, to speak out against the oil and gas industry. What could possibly be more hypocritical than that? Anyway, I bring all this up because I love that the oil industry is fighting back. This is an oil company, an energy company CEO.
So North Face is not only an extraordinary customer of the oil and gas industry, they are also a partner with the oil and gas industry in bringing the great outdoors within reach of so many. So thank you, North Face, and you're welcome. Onward and upward.
They came up with a website, thankyounorthface.com. All right, love it. More pushback. We need more pushback. Be wise with where you spend your money. And if you're in a position of influence, don't fall to the woke crowd. Companies have caved to the left because these leftist activists are vocal. All I want is companies to ultimately just, be more conservative would be good, but just be neutral. And if they see conservatives spending their money appropriately, then they'll stop being trans activists. So, on today's show, we're going to make sense of all this. We're going to start off with the author of The Dictatorship of Woke Capital, How Political Correctness Captured Big Business. He's fantastic. We're going to talk about the march through the institutions. Where did all this start? We're going to go back to the 1800s, and then through Marxism and the influence and the march through the institutions, and how the business was the last institutional domino to fall in this march. Fantastic background of all of this. It all makes sense. Then Mark Hemingway. Mark Hemingway is going to tell us who controls these left-wing boycotts, the systematic, organized boycott against conservative media. And then we'll wrap up with Andy Puzder, who's the former CEO of Carl's Jr. and Hardee's, on the true motivation of these CEOs and these boards. Like, who are are these guys really believers in what they do? What are the pressures they're facing? Why are they doing this, really? Where's this marketing come from? Like when Oreo says trans lives exist or whatever, like who is that? And then, of course, how we can fight back. So we'll start off with the march through the institutions and how business was the last domino to fall. That's what we got coming up. The woke of Wall Street. Glad you're here. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, welcome back to the special, The Woke of Wall Street. If you want to fully understand the reasons and the depth and the future of what's happening now that big business has gone woke, please read The Dictatorship of Woke Capital. Fantastic book, How Political Correctness Captured Big Business. It is a must read by Stephen Sukup, who's the executive director and president of the Political Forum Institute. Mr. Sukup, how are you, sir?
I'm well. How are you?
Really good. I think it's so important that people understand this march through the institutions. Can you start from the very beginning of that, and where are we on this march at this moment?
Well, the march through the institutions in the United States actually began in the late 19th century. I start the book in 1876 at Johns Hopkins University, where a man named Woodrow Wilson is a PhD student studying under a man named Richard Ely. And if those names sound familiar, that's because they're two of the godfathers of American progressivism. And they start with this idea that the American people simply are not competent, educated, or selfless enough to govern themselves. And they need an institutionalized governing class to take care of them, to make sure that all the important decisions turn out correctly, and that government is able to function effectively without the people, without the demos getting in the way. So that's the first very important idea in this development of woke capital in this country. You can jump ahead from there to about 1920, 1921, the end of World War I in Europe, where the Marxists are sitting around scratching their heads trying to figure out what happened. Why did the workers fight for Germany? Why did the workers fight for France? Why did the workers fight for England? Why did they not unite as Marx expected them to? And the solution that they came up with, the answer to that question, was that the workers suffered from false consciousness, that there was a dominant cultural, what they called a cultural hegemony, that kept the workers from understanding their true needs, their true desires, and their true nature. And so they set about making what was later called the Long March through the institutions to change the culture. They started with education. They took education. They took mainstream religion. They took the media. They took all of the institutions of cultural transmission except one, and that was the free markets and big business. Probably around 1970, about the same time that Milton Friedman was making his case that a corporation's primary responsibility is to its shareholders, the cultural left began its attack on American business and began its attack pushing back on Friedman and on free markets.
We have a ton of questions. Let's continue on, though, and then I want to go back. So you say the 70s is when the woke started to infiltrate or attack business. It feels more recent than that, right? Or is it just now coming, it's now blooming, the infiltration?
No, absolutely. Now it's blooming. It took a while to get moving, but now it's definitely started to take hold. In the late 1970s, a man named Edward Freeman, who was a philosopher, just finished his PhD in philosophy at Washington University in St. Louis, takes a job at the University of Pennsylvania in their business consulting unit. and decides that he wants to democratize business. He wants to democratize markets. And so he sets about trying to figure out how to do that. And what he ends up doing is creating an entire new ethical system, an entirely new moral code for business that he calls stakeholder capitalism, which he intends to replace the shareholder model that was explained so thoroughly and so clearly by Milton Friedman in 1970. So that's where it really gets going. Freeman's primary attack on the shareholder model, his opus on stakeholder capitalism, is published in the mid-1980s. And from there, business schools start to adopt that model as well. And once the educational establishment adopts it, it becomes part of the business curriculum and then becomes part of American business as we know it.
What is stakeholder capitalism? I've heard it before, but I don't know what it is.
Well, stakeholder capitalism is an interesting concept. It started actually in the 1960s, where a group of consultants from the Stanford Research Institute published a document saying that in order for business to be successful, it needs to consider more than just its owners and its shareholders. It also needs to consider its employees, its customers, the environment in which it operates, the community in which it operates, etc. It was a purely pragmatic idea that, you know, if you want to succeed, you have to take these other variables into consideration. You can't just worry about how much money you're making. And it's perfectly understandable and common sense that this would be the case. Over the course of the next, say, 15 to 20 years, this stakeholder idea begins to morph into an idea of supporting those other players, those other stakeholders, more than shareholders, then become the idea that they are more important than shareholders. So it becomes more of a normative, more of an ethical model as opposed to simply a pragmatic model. And where we stand today is this idea that stakeholders are far more important than shareholders, that if business is going to be truly successful, then it has to be truly socially conscious as well, and consider everyone and everything, including the global environment, before it considers shareholders. So, you know, it's a complete 180 from where it started, which was a pragmatic plan for businesses to succeed, to becoming a part of the social justice movement.
Yes. Oh man, that digression makes so much sense. Okay, let's give an example. One of your chapters is the House of Mouse contaminated by rotten apples? What does that mean?
Well, that's obviously a reference to Disney. And Disney, the contamination by rotten apples is Disney has, for probably the last quarter century, very much followed the patterns set by Apple. For a long time, Laurene Powell Jobs, who is Steve Jobs' widow, was the single largest shareholder of Apple stock. For a long time, Bob Iger, the CEO of Disney, served on the Apple board of directors. So the two companies have followed a very similar business model, despite their different sectors, over the past quarter century. And a lot of what they've done has been to push social justice at home in the United States, while nevertheless partnering with the Chinese Communist Party in the People's Republic of China.
That connection with China is so fascinating, and I think most people, it became very obvious with the NBA and how the NBA refuses to say anything about what goes on in China and is taking China's propaganda. You know, we've seen it with the map, like the Chinese map with the dotted lines and the South China Sea, and pushing that on ESPN, which is owned by Disney. Why? I think the answer is money, right? But is there anything else going on there?
Well, yes, it's money. 1.4 billion people, it's the largest potential market in the world. In fact, for Apple, it's not only their second largest market right now and potentially their largest market in the future, it's also their largest manufacturing hub. China is very important to Apple. China is very important to Disney. China is very important to most entertainment companies. It's very important to a lot of American businesses, in particular, a lot of them that are very socially conscious, very woke at home, which is ironic, but it nevertheless demonstrates just how specious this belief in social justice can be among some of these woke CEOs.
Yeah, because it's more than hypocrisy. The fact that these companies can have a shareholder model in China, only concerned about the money, but a pseudo stakeholder model here in America and be more concerned about transgender rights or whatever. Like that's beyond hypocrisy. Who are the believers in this, and what's their end goal?
To be honest with you, I don't know who the believers are in this. I would say Tim Cook is a believer, but for some reason, it strikes me that even he would have trouble sleeping, knowing that, for example, Apple has, according to various investigations by various international human rights organizations, benefited significantly from slave labor performed by the Uyghurs in China, who are currently undergoing what amounts to a cultural genocide at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party. But yet, this is something that has benefited Apple financially. And I just don't see how even Tim Cook can possibly think that that's okay. And yet, he never says a thing. He never does a thing. All new functions on iPhones to protect privacy at home are banned in China. The Chinese government controls the sites that holds all the data for the users of Apple products in China. So it's really a bizarre situation. And to be honest with you, I can't explain it. It's almost as if these woke CEOs are also Gnostics, I guess would be the word. They believe that they understand how to tame the Chinese dragon and that nobody else does. And that eventually they will, and that they will turn the Chinese Communist Party into a free market democracy. I can't really explain it otherwise.
Sure. Yeah, and that won't happen. I guess there's so many questions. We only got about a minute. I wanted to talk about the arrogance of the very beginning, like Woodrow Wilson, and then all these Marxists and false consciousness and the arrogance of these people to think that they know better than the rest of the people. I want to save that for people who are going to go buy the book. So let's go to the conclusion of all this. What's the problem? The business was the last domino to fall in this march through the institutions. I can't think of any other institution that has not been infiltrated by these Marxists and woke. So what's the problem with business falling? We know the problem with education falling. We know the problem with medicine falling. What's the problem with business domino falling?
Well, the thing that the businessmen who espouse this model, who espouse the cultural leftist model, the problem is that they don't appear to understand what the original motivations were. And if you go back to the post-war Marxists, their idea was to change the culture, but not just for the sake of changing the culture, to change the culture in order to foster the revolution. That once you've convinced people of their true consciousness, once you've rid them of this false consciousness, then you can have your revolution. So if American business falls, then there's really nothing that can protect us from a completely overbearing, dominating, overreaching government. There is no buffer any longer between the people and the state.
Love it. So I hate it. But what is the revolution exactly? How would you describe the revolution? What does that look like?
Well, initially they meant it as a communist revolution. Workers of the world unite, take the means of production, etc. I think clearly the left's thinking on economics has evolved somewhat from that, but they still believe that they can harness the power of the state to do good in ways that will diminish liberty, diminish freedom, diminish economic opportunity, and so on. And I think if they are able fully to capture business, that's exactly the course they will pursue.
100%. The Dictatorship of Woke Capital. Go buy it now. How political correctness captured big business by Stephen Sukup from the Political Forum Institute. Stephen, appreciate this book and thanks for your time.
Thank you very much for having me, Mike. I'm glad.
Yeah. Thank you. Milton Friedman always had a great line that there's a big difference between being pro-business and pro-free markets. Because pro-business can mean the government gets involved with business and colludes with business and is corrupt with business. Pro-free markets is what we really need to stand for. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, welcome back to our special, The Woke of Wall Street. So we just talked about the whole march through the institutions and business is the last domino to fall. But I want to talk about it now from the other side, if you will, from the boycott angle. Before we get to our next guest, I want to play this spot here. This is from Consumers Research. They put out the magazine Consumer Reports that we've all seen before. They're pushing back against Nike, who we all know has gone maybe the most woke of anyone. Here's their ad they made.
Nike is constantly political. Why? Cover. Congressional reports suspect Nike used forced labor in China. Religious minorities were ripped from their families, sterilized, sold to factories. Nike made shoes in those same areas. Congress tried to ban Nike's labor practices. Nike fought back with highly paid lobbyists. Rather than hiring Americans, Nike chose China. John Donahoe, Nike. Stop exploiting foreign labor. Serve your customers, not woke politicians.
Naming names. Mark Hemingway is here. He's senior writer at Real Clear Investigations. Wrote a great article, The New Business of Woke Corporate Consulting and the Business of Boycotts. Mr. Hemingway, how are you, sir?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Great to talk to you. So, how do you think of this? Who's leading it here? Like, which came first? The woke corporations or these political activists who are pressuring these corporations to go woke?
Well, I think it's like a lot of things that happen on the left where it's kind of a hive mind, basically. You know, the sort of confluence of political and cultural trends make sure that they just kind of, march in lockstep.
What are some of these big players in the boycott world? Because it's getting more official.
Right. So the big left-wing activist group that has been organizing all of these boycotts, or a lot of them, I should say, is a group called Sleeping Giants that was founded a few years back by two people working in the advertising industry. And what was interesting was that at first these people were anonymous because the idea that you'd be organizing these boycotts and be in the advertising industry was seen as bad. And now these people are practically celebrities on the left, although as I write about in the story, these people are so woke that the two partners that founded the organization, one man and one woman, the woman left accusing the man of sexism and running the organization and has founded her own sort of quasi-boycott organization.
What do these guys do?
Well, so this is what's sort of crazy about it is they're able to accomplish so much with doing relatively little. They organize social media boycott campaigns. So they've got a few 100,000 Twitter followers for their account, and whenever a company does something they don't like, or they advertise on Fox News or whatever it is, they put out a call to tweet at or send Facebook messages to this particular corporation or advertiser and say, hey, what you're doing is awful. And then, they've been remarkably successful at using this tactic to get corporations to back down from their, advertising commitments that might support, differing viewpoints or, companies run by people who are to the right of center. And what's sort of interesting about this, though, is that it's taken a few years, but corporations, I think, now are actually pretty savvy. They know that 1,000 tweets don't actually represent any broad-based opinion that's going to hurt their product. What's happening is that the corporations themselves are now woke. So the woke employees within the corporation are using the 1,000 tweets that don't mean anything in the real world to pretend that they have this crisis on their hands, and they use that as a justification for their boycotts that the people within the company already want to do.
All right, let's go that one more time, because I was just going to ask you why companies fall for this when a couple tweets come at them from anonymous accounts. And we hear about this all the time. It's like sometimes it's like 3 tweets with people with like 14 followers and a company caves. You're like, what's going on here? So it's more than just they're scared of losing a few customers, right? That can't be the reason why they cave.
Right. No, the reason why is because the employees within their company themselves have now become super woke. And they are the ones that are also protesting this. And they want to leverage whatever institutional or financial power their company has to push their political agenda. And, you know, they've been remarkably successful at this. I mean, there's been some pretty remarkable instances of this in Silicon Valley in particular. A lot of the direction that Facebook has headed in since, you know, Donald Trump became president in terms of censorship and other things like that has been largely driven by employees. You know, there was an incident, I think has long been forgotten, where close to the 2016 election, one of Facebook's employees was a guy named Palmer Luckey, who's the founder of Oculus, the company that makes the VR headsets. Facebook bought his company for $3 billion. Palmer Luckey is known as a huge visionary in Silicon Valley. But employees at Facebook discovered that he'd given $10,000 to a pro-Trump group just before the election, and it set off this panic mode at Facebook. And Facebook ended up firing Palmer Luckey in March of 2017, and Luckey got a $100 million settlement from Facebook over his firing. Wow. Zuckerberg to this day publicly insists that his firing had nothing to do with politics, but it had everything to do with politics. You don't pay $100 million to make someone go away. He doesn't have a wrongful termination lawsuit on his hands.
Wow. My example off the top of my head is of the internal politics of just the New York Times. Remember when Tom Cotton wrote an editorial and people freaked out within the New York Times, and the editorial editor ended up quitting, resigning, and all this, and shame. Do boycotts work? That's a big question, but do boycotts work? And is there a difference between when conservatives do it or when progressives do it? Do progressives do it more often, et cetera?
I mean, there's no sustained organized boycott movement on the right, and there hasn't been for years. I mean, in the late 90s, you had things like the Southern Baptists, boycotting Disney over their stance on, gay issues and things like that. But I mean, there hasn't been anything like that from the moral majority or anything like that in decades. I mean, it's almost exclusively coming from the left these days. As for whether or not boycotts work, you might recall they organized a big boycott over Goya Foods because the CEO was supporting Trump. And Goya's sales actually went up from the publicity. I mean, there's no real reason to believe that these boycotts are having a lot of success. What boycotts are doing is they're destroying the entire advertising industry. A lot of advertisers are very skittish to advertise with anything controversial anymore. And what's interesting is that the majority of ad dollars now go to online ads, which are very specifically targeted according to the content, which means that big advertisers online are now making sure that their ads don't appear next to anything controversial. So if you write a story that has the words Trump, blood, or lesbian in it, there's a very good chance that there's a massive blacklist of advertisers that don't want to, advertise against anything that has any of those words in the content. And they've done studies that show that the media are losing out in hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue in the last few years because corporations are backing away from advertising against anything political or controversial.
Oh, interesting. Which would mean that news companies may not be reporting on certain stories because they would not get the advertising dollars out of them?
Yeah, in theory. But, in some cases, I mean, these advertising bans are so far-fetched. I mean, it's crazy. A study from the business school at the University of Baltimore focused in on the fact that corporations were adding the word coronavirus and COVID to their advertising blacklists in the last year. And, I can't remember the exact figures. It's in my story, but hundreds of millions of dollars in just like 4 months in advertising revenue just vanished for news organizations because corporations are that skittish about advertising against anything controversial, even when it's the biggest story on the planet.
Wow, that's really interesting. Okay, my last question for you, Mark. Where do you stand on this? Like, what is a company's social responsibility? And what is a person's responsibility even of supporting a company that supports bad things, right? There must be a line, because if a company came out horrifically and supported like eugenics, then you wouldn't want to support them. But but where is the line where it is appropriate to maybe not support a company anymore? Or do politics not matter at all? You should just buy a product because the soap is really good at cleaning your clothes. Like, how do you make sense of this?
Well, there's certainly an argument for the Milton Friedman libertarian argument that the only, duty a company has is basically to its shareholders and, to turn a profit. And that in the end does the most good. I mean, I think in the real world, things are a little more complicated. And companies obviously do have to make moral judgments. And there are some, controversial subjects or, say, there's an issue with a pedophile or something like that. Obviously, you're going to want to back away from that. But the big issue here is that we have a situation here where we're not supporting basically a culture of free speech. We are skewing financial incentives for the media, and we're creating an information climate that is, basically entirely asymmetric, because the left is the only group that is applying pressure in this environment where, the idea is to, separate and marginalize any voices on the right that might, counter their narratives. And as we've seen in the last year with, issues like the Wuhan lab leak, Hunter Biden's corruption, there's all these stories where these snap narratives form and they try and isolate people who have differing opinions. And it turns out that those differing opinions that went against the mainstream were entirely correct. And that's happening with more and more frequency. So we've got to actually look at these financial incentives that are being created by boycotts and ask if they're in our best interest as a society, both in terms of supporting a long-term culture of free speech, but also in terms of getting the truth as opposed to whatever is the most favorable political narrative on a given day.
Amen. So what do conservatives do? Do we boycott better? Do we not pay attention? So if there's a company that's super Black Lives Matter and supports transgender surgery on kids, what's a conservative to do? Ignore that or push back twice as hard?
I have my private opinions, but and obviously I don't think I'm, hiding the fact that I'm a center-right individual. But part of my vocation as a journalist is, believe it or not, is I feel like I'm not necessarily the guy that should be answering those questions. And then part of the problem is we have an entire mainstream, center-left press corps that thinks they are the people that should be activists. Now, do I think that we have a strong interest in having a culture of free speech and providing incentives for journalists to tell the truth as opposed to political narratives? Absolutely. I don't know what the answer is. It's complicated, but I do know that the information environment out there is scary, and the consequences could be quite bad if we don't deal with it. But I do think that pressure somehow should probably be put on people to do what's right and to be fair. I mean that's an American value, and I think that it's not too much to ask that they don't always skew to one side.
Yeah, that's it. Mark Hemingway, Real Clear Politics. The article is, Real Clear Investigations, the new business of woke corporate consulting. Mark Hemingway, great to talk to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
The woke of Wall Street. More coming up. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, welcome back to our grand finale of the Woke of Wall Street. I want to go to the former CEO of CKE Restaurants. That's Carl's Jr., Hardee's, Red and Green Burrito, and he's now a senior fellow at Pepperdine University, Mr. Andy Puzder. Mr. Puzder, how are you, sir?
Great, Mike. How are you?
Great, good to talk to you. Let's start this first. Have you ever seen businesses go so woke ever, or just so collectively in line with what? Like the cultural ethos of the day? Like, have you ever seen anything like this?
I know it's really picked up over the past year or so, particularly during the pandemic. And it's picked up particularly because investment funds like BlackRock, for example, which manages about $9 trillion in pension fund assets, 401k assets, manages assets for other people. They didn't used to vote their shares. Well, now they've decided to vote their shares, and the CEO of BlackRock, Larry Fink, was very into radical environmental policy, these radical cancel culture diversity programs. So it's really picked up, I think, with the ESG investing criteria impacting investment funds. And BlackRock's not the only one. There's Vanguard, State Street. Their investment funds manage about $60 trillion in assets. So a lot of pressure on CEOs when they are voting in those shareholder meetings.
Oh, well, that's super interesting. Okay, and something like I would never understand. So you're saying these businesses are going woke not so much for marketing purposes or for the people, but to answer to these very few people who run these massive investment firms.
Yeah, well, I mean, a company like Nike would go woke because they believe that appeals to their target market. And in fact, when you hear Nike's CEO out there bragging about the Colin Kaepernick ad, about how he doesn't brag about the social justice aspects. He brags about the fact that it was a successful campaign. In other words, it appealed to his target market. That's viewed as woke capitalism, but that's just plain old capitalism. He had an ad campaign that appealed to his target market. For Coca-Cola, that didn't work so well. They tried to do. They went woke on the Georgia voting law. They went woke on this diversity program, radical diversity program. And there was a poll by Rasmussen that said 37% of Americans were less likely to buy Coke because of its position on these issues. So Coke had to back off. They had a different customer base. The problem with this ESG investing is that people like Larry Fink, who aren't voting their own shares, they're voting the shares of investors, people that invest in these pension funds. It's not Larry Fink's stock that he's voting. He's voting the shares of people that invest indirectly in their funds. And that's massive power. So if you have companies that don't appeal to a woke audience, let's eliminate Starbucks or Nike or Patagonia that would appeal to the kind of woke, the woke community. If you're a company like Coca-Cola, you're going to find that you have real problems just appealing to woke investors. You would try not to do that, but then you get pressure from these shareholder groups, these investment funds that control massive amounts of shares. BlackRock is the number 1, 2, or 3 largest shareholder in 80% of the companies in the S&P 500. That's massive shareholder power, and they can force these companies that otherwise wouldn't go towards this ESG investing, this woke capitalism, to go in that direction. It's very bad. We're ending up with people like Larry Fink creating this sort of a corporatocracy, they call it, where rather than a Republican form of government as we have now, where we vote and pick our representatives, we'd have these capitalist business leaders deciding economic and social policy, and that's very dangerous and a real risk to our country.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you what percentage these companies have, like BlackRock, these investments are having. But you said so they're either the number 1, 2, or 3 investor in 80% of the. How did you word that again?
It was a first, second, or third largest shareholder in 80% of the companies in the S&P 500, and that doesn't include very large companies like State Street or Vanguard that follow BlackRock and own even not equally large positions, but very large positions.
Unbelievable.
It's a real threat.
Absolutely. So try to, as a former CEO yourself, help us understand the pressures that a CEO are under, because I want to ask you, like, who are the true believers in all of this? Because you have the CEO, you have the board, you have the employees, you have this group I didn't even consider, these outside investors or pension fund investors. And then you have customers, right? Who are the real believers that are driving all this wokeness, as opposed to just, let's just make a great product and make money?
It's people on the progressive left. It's the people that have taken over the education establishment. They've taken over the entertainment establishment. They've weaponized them to advance progressive culture. They're now trying to take over the business community. And when you have people with these that accumulate this massive power, this massive shareholder power, they elect the directors. They pass shareholder resolutions that direct management as to what direction they should go in. When you have those with these progressives leading these large institutional funds, you really have a problem. Now, consumers are still important. Like I pointed out with Coca-Cola, if you don't like Nike's policies or Nike's ads, stop buying Nikes. I mean, it does have an impact. I think a lot of people think they can't have an impact because, my God, how could I affect Coca-Cola? It's so big. It's across the world. What difference would it make? Well, it does make a difference, because when you're a CEO, your sales don't need to be down 50% for you to get concerned. If they're down 2 or 3%, you're wondering what's wrong. If they're down 10 or 15%, you're wondering what your next job's going to be. So consumers can have an impact on these CEOs, and it's important for people to realize that. They drive this. Every CEO, I guarantee, even the woke CEOs, even the 181 CEOs that signed the Business Roundtable Stakeholder Capitalist Statement, when they went and reported to their board of directors, I guarantee you they were reporting on the profitability of their company. They weren't going in there and saying, oh, look at all these woke things we did, and now we're going to go out of business. We're losing money, but aren't we really good guys? If you go in and do that, you lose your job. So, I mean, they're reporting on profitability. So if you don't like what you're seeing, stop buying the products of the companies you disagree with. That's what you can do as a consumer. The bigger problem is these investment funds and their power to vote those shares.
I got a question about marketing.
Sure.
And Carl's Jr. has had some marketing in the past as well, as you know. I wonder, generally, where does marketing start and where does the buck stop? And I ask for companies like Gillette, who did their crazy, like, toxic masculinity campaign a couple years ago now, I guess. And I'm looking at ads like Oreo. Like, Oreo's gone all in on transgenderism. Right? And you're like, what are you, like, what, who, where's this come from, the marketing side?
Well, normally you'd like to think that it comes from research as to the brand's target market, to see who they're appealing to, who they need, who the ad needs to address, who their products need to address. That's certainly what we did when I ran CKE. But now you're getting pressure from these outside groups to at least appear woke, and there's different ways to do this. You know, like, for example, when you go to a hotel and they have a sign up that says, you know, we're not going to wash your towel because we're green. You know, we're green, so we're not washing your towel. Yeah, well, you know, I mean, how many people sit back and say, well, thank God you're not washing my towel? You know, thank you so much for not doing that. Nobody really thinks that. They're trying to appear green. So they're trying to do it without risk. The problem is when people take a big risk. And I think if you look at the NFL, this is a perfect example. They went all in on this Colin Kaepernick kneeling. They allowed it, not realizing apparently that the woke progressive crowd really wasn't the biggest fans of NFL football. In fact, they kind of opposed the NFL for its brutality. They were really appealing to guys that like to sit down, have a beer, watch a football game, and probably voted for Donald Trump. So you've seen the Super Bowl, people watching the Super Bowl, a huge plunge in the ratings because they didn't look to who their target market was. They tried to appeal to the woke crowd and they lost business. The Oscars are another very good example. I mean, they've gone from 23 million viewers down to 9.9 million viewed, the most recent Oscars, because you can't watch them. I mean, I used to like to watch them. I can't watch them now. I don't want to see all this political baloney when I watch the Oscars. So they lost a huge chunk of their audience. So I think you've got CEOs who are misguided and are attempting to respond to the desires of this woke crowd. And if they're not careful, it hurts your business. You know, Dane Yogurt, the CEO got fired because the company focused too much on these woke issues and lost track of making a profit. So he's gone. You've got to be very careful if you're doing this. And I think that it should originate in marketing research, but I think a lot of it's originating from pressure from these shareholder groups, these investment funds, and from pressure from the left that everybody has to look woke, or you're part of the past, not part of the future.
We've got about a minute left, sir. So what's a person to do, all right? So obviously you mentioned don't buy these products, be smart, smart investor and consumer. How does one know where they should be spending their money or shouldn't? And I don't want to be, I'm not a boycott guy, and conservatives haven't been boycott people. Is that what you're calling for, or is it something different than that?
No, I just look, if you're a consumer and you don't like what a company's doing, do what the left does. Stop buying their product. You don't have to go out and do a huge boycott. And the more dangerous part of this, these investment funds going into these shareholder meetings with huge interest. I'm involved with a group called Second Vote Funds, which this first vote is at the ballot box. The second vote is with your investment. And we offer 2 publicly traded ETFs that focus on companies that make a profit, not companies that are focused on politics. Our investment philosophy is companies focused on profit will be more profitable than companies that aren't focused on profit. I think that makes perfect sense. And we also, the 2 ETFs tie into social issues as well. There's a Second Amendment ETF. If you're a Second Amendment supporter, that's the ETF for you. It's EGIS. And a pro-life ETF, LYFT, LYFE. Which again, you won't have companies in that ETF that oppose the pro-life position. So there are companies making efforts to try and combat this woke capitalism effort. And we're getting into the game late. Conservatives woke up to this. By the time we woke up to it, the left had done a whole lot. Same with, again, with education institution and entertainment. We woke up too late. Hopefully we haven't woken up too late with respect to the business community, and we'll start seeing some real progress here in the near future.
I'm grateful you're a part of it. Andy Puzder, former CEO of CKE Restaurants. I feel like I was just in a business seminar at Pepperdine University, sir. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, Mike. See you later.
Have a wonderful day. Woke of Wall Street. That's our special. Be smart with where you spend your money and where you're spending your time. That's why I'm grateful you've been here. True story. Mike Slater. Spread the word.